Welcome back to Haunt, you restless spirits. Today I have with me, I forgot to ask how I pronounce your name, so I hope I don't butcher it, but tell me if I do.
It's
David Domine?
Domine. Yep.
Domine? Okay,
Yep.
so close. Okay, because I saw the little, I forget what that's called on the end.
Yeah, the little accent. That's kind of my pen name. When I'm not writing, I'm just playing David Domine without the accent. When I'm a writer, I put the accent on there. It makes it look a little fancier.
Oh, it does. It's so official. So he is the author of a book that caught my eye. I don't even know who that was that reached out to me
Mhm.
from your camp, but I was glad when they did because immediately I was like, well, of course I would like to talk with him if he would be willing to. But he wrote A Dark Room in Glitter Ball City: Murder, Secrets, and Scandal in Old Louisville. And look at this awesome cover. Isn't that? I love that. It's beautiful. And the book, I've got it in my Kindle now, so I will be reading because this sounds amazing. But let me tell you what caught my eye because I'll have a question about this too. Um, Part of the spiel was when they wrote to me, said that your book shares the story of Joseph Banis, am I saying that right? And Jeffrey Mundt and their involvement in the murder of James Carroll in an old Louisville mansion that once served as a sanatorium. So I was like, well, what in the heck is this all about? So why don't you tell, for people who don't know, how did you like what I mean, it's very fascinating, but what drew you to the story to want to write about it? And
Mhm.
what is it about? I guess start
Yeah,
there too.
yeah. So back to the cover. I'm glad you like it. This is my 13th book, and of all my books, this is my favorite cover. I think it's
Oh,
yeah. When the publisher sent me the first mock-up of the cover, kind of took my breath away. It wasn't what I was expecting at all, but it's beautiful. So the designer at Pegasus did a really great job. But yeah, so I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm not from here originally. I moved here in the 1990s. I'm from Wisconsin, and I came to go to law school, and my plan was to do my time and get out of town. I had no desires to come to Louisville, Kentucky. I'd never been here before. And well, that was back in 1993. Here it is, almost 2023, and I'm still in Louisville. I've been here half my life now. The city really kind of sucked me in. It's an interesting place to live. It's a very easygoing kind of city, and one of the things that drew me to the city was this neighborhood called Old Louisville. And Old Louisville is one of the largest collections of Victorian mansions in the United States. It's one of the largest historic preservation districts. There's 45 square blocks of old houses from the 1880s, 1890s, roughly 1,400 structures in all. And so I've always been a history lover. I've always, loved architecture, and I've been fascinated by old houses. So, I, I, I lived in Old Louisville, and I just started to walk around and talk to people and learn about the neighborhood and its fascinating history. A lot of bohemian, a lot of quirky kind of people live there. And in 1999, I bought a house on 3rd Street. My house was small by Old Louisville standards. It was only about 4,000 square feet. It had 6 bedrooms. That's small in the neighborhood. And right before I moved in, the previous owner just casually mentioned that there was a ghost that came with the house. And I love ghost stories, but I'm a skeptic. I say when I see a ghost, that's when I'll start believing in them. So I just kind of poo pooed her warnings, and I moved in. And sure enough, all the strange things she said her poltergeist named Lucy was known to do began to happen. I began hearing footsteps in the middle of the night, and my cats and dogs started acting crazy, like they were seeing things I couldn't see. Um, the last thing she told me before I moved in was to not hang pictures on this one particular wall. Of course, I moved in, and what's the first thing I did? I hung a picture on that wall. And by the end of the day, it was down on the floor, broken. We never could have pictures on that wall. Well, long story short, that first year of the 8 years I lived in that house, we had all these things happen that people would say were paranormal in nature. But I never saw the ghost I was hoping to see in the end. So I'm still kind of a skeptic today. I'm a firm believer in the paranormal, whatever that might be. But during that time, I got to meet my neighbors and fellow homeowners, and they all had stories to tell about their houses, and some of them had spooky things going on. So that led me to start writing down stories from the neighborhood as a way for me to do my part to help promote and get the word out about the neighborhood and try to preserve some of the local lore and legends, just to let people know what an interesting neighborhood it was. And so I moved out of that house in 2008, and I was looking for another house. And at that time, I heard that the Richard Robinson mansion had come on the market. And it was just right around the corner, 2 blocks away on 4th Street from the house I was living in. And I was a food writer at the time. I was working on my first cookbook and I was doing restaurant reviews and travel pieces. But I heard the Richard Robinson house, which was built around 1898, had the original wine cellar from when the family bought it and built it originally. And I got in my head, I thought, oh, I want a wine cellar. And so I made an appointment with the real estate agent and I went and looked at the house, and it was a disaster. It was almost 3 times the size of my house. There was like there was 11, 12 bedrooms. It was way over 10,000 square feet just on the main 3 floors, but it needed so much work. I mean, the kitchen looked bombed out. The carriage house was falling apart. I went down and I looked at the wine cellar, and the basement of the mansion is just kind of a maze-like warren of rooms. There were all these little interconnected rooms, and I found the wine cellar. It was a corner room, and it was one of the few rooms in the basement that had a dirt floor. And so I made my way to the wine cellar, and you could barely tell it was a wine cellar. You saw the dirt floor, and then on the far walls, you could see the outline where shelves had been at one time to hold wine. But previous tenants, they had like thrown boxes of junk in there. It was just a disaster. So I said, you know, I was up for a challenge, but that was too much of a remodeling challenge. And so I said, no, thanks. And so I left my appointment with the real estate agent, and I think messages popped through. I got everything on pause. Sorry. But I told the real estate agent, no, thanks. And so I left, and I was going down the front stairs, going down to the sidewalk, and a guy was rushing up the stairs, and he kind of bumped into me as he passed. It was the guy who had the appointment after I did. And I guess he was running late. So he was in a hurry. He bumped into me and didn't even say, excuse me or sorry. And he just rushed through the door. And so I was like, okay, whatever. Didn't think much of it. And until 2 years later. So it was the morning of June 18th, 2010. And I was drinking my morning coffee, watching TV, and all of a sudden, a local news flash popped up. And there was a familiar looking house, a big boxy red brick house. I thought, that must be an Old Louisville. And then a mugshot popped up. And it was the guy who had the appointment with the real estate agent that day that I looked at it. His name was Jeffrey Mundt. He was a local guy, and he had been arrested the night before at that house on 4th Street, the Richard Robinson house, because the night before, 911 had been called, and they went to the house thinking they were responding to a domestic disturbance. And at the time, Jeffrey Mundt, the owner of the house, was living there with his boyfriend, a guy named Joey Banis, who's also a local guy. And so the police separated them and interviewed each of them, as they do when they respond to a domestic disturbance situation. And in the process, that's when they began hearing grumblings about somebody knowing something where a dead body was buried. And they didn't really take it seriously until one of them broke down and gave them a name and said, I know where the body of James Carroll is. It's someone from Eastern Kentucky. He's been missing for 7 months and nobody even knows he's missing. And the police didn't take it seriously at all. But one of the detectives decided to call around and just make sure, And sure enough, within 2 hours, one of the detectives found out, sure enough, there was a guy named James Carroll. They called him Jamie, from the eastern part of the state. And he had been missing for 7 months. Nobody realized that he had been missing.
Oh my
And
gosh.
all of a sudden, they realized that the guy who was telling them his story knew something. And so they interrogated him all night long. And he finally broke down and told them where the body was. Guess where the body was?
The wine cellar. Oh no! Oh my
Yeah. Police went down there, and actually, you can see what they found that night because it just so happened that A&E was in town following the Louisville police around. Louisville is one of the cities that has a contract with the First 48, so this is one of the many true crime shows the murder of Jamie Carroll has been on, and they were down there. They filmed this whole thing, and you can watch it. But they started to dig, and 4 feet below the surface, they unearthed a blue Rubbermaid container, and in it were the remains of Jamie Carroll. He had been shot and stabbed. They had used a sledgehammer to fit his body inside. And so both guys were arrested and charged with murder eventually. Um, but even though they eventually admitted to their part in covering up the crime and hiding the body, they both insisted the other had done it. And both insisted that they had been living in fear of the other for the previous 7 months. And that's why they hadn't gone to the police. So 3 years later, we had the most scandalous set of murder trials the city has seen in a long time. They called it the trial of he said, because they kind of both pointed the finger at each other. Some called it the pink triangle murder because it was kind of like a lover's triangle and they were all gay. And so being nosy like I am and loving true crime and spooky stuff and living in the neighborhood and writing about the neighborhood, I sat through both of those trials wanting to find out more. And I'd always loved John Barrett's book about Savannah, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And I read it when I was living in Old Louisville, and I kind of looked around and thought, wait, we got all this stuff in Old Louisville. We got big old beautiful mansions, and we got lots of drag queens and interesting people and eccentrics, and there's old money and new money, and there's scandal and gossip. And uh, I'd always striven to kind of accentuate the quirky bits of the neighborhood and the city. And so I quickly realized there was enough material there to write a book. So I sat in on the trials, and then I started doing research. And it took me over 10 years, but it finally came out just last year. A Dark Room in Glitterball City came out. And I'm glad it's over and done with. It was 10 years of my life that, you know,
gosh.
was all consuming. I had to take breaks every now and then because a lot of dark things emerged. But what happened was I ended up writing this book that, looks into the murder of Jamie Carroll, trying to figure out what happened that night, why they killed him. And the trials are over, but there's still a lot of questions as to whether the jury got the verdicts right. Did both guys kill him together, or was it one and he blamed it on the other? There were so many strange aspects to this case, which is fascinating in and of itself. But what happened was, after the trials ended, that's when I began to find out more about the house itself. And the house itself, the Richard Robinson Mansion, was kind of a neighborhood character for 100 years before that. Already back in the 1920s, they were calling it a haunted place because previous owners had died under mysterious circumstances there. So the neighborhood legend was. And of course, if you're a spooky old Victorian house, you have to be a sanatorium at one time in your history, right? So for a number of years, there was a sanatorium there, and a guy named Dr. Bandine was promising to cure people of cancer. And all these poor souls were coming to him in high hopes and in droves, hoping to be cured, and they weren't. He was he was a quack, selling them snake oil. And most of them were coming to him and dying and suffering under his care. And he had terrible bedside manner. He enjoyed telling his patients they were going to die, getting a
Oh my
reaction.
gosh.
So he was kind of a sadist. And not surprising, he was brought up on ethics charges, and he was ruined in the end. He was accused of killing two of his patients outright. And then from that point forward, the house just took on a more sinister reputation. It seemed like every 3 or 4 years, whoever moved into the house, it would claim like another victim. There'd be financial ruin that would befall the family. There'd be catastrophic accident where someone was killed, or terrible illness. Every 3 or 4 years, it seemed that a family came and went. And that went on till the 1960s. That's when a young nurse named Pauline Boren bought the place, and she kind of broke the curse that people said had been put upon the house. She was there for like almost 30 years until one night, a guy she was renting a room to went berserk and savagely attacked her and beat her so severely she died of her injuries. And
Oh,
it was Pauline Boren's family who ended up selling the house to Jeffrey Mundt. For 10 years, it kind of sat largely unused. People, they'd rent out a room or an apartment every now and then, but for the most part, the house just kind of sat vacant and kind of falling down around everyone until Jeffrey Mundt bought the place. And so the house itself has, an interesting history. And then when I started doing more research, I found out that Joey and Jeffrey, the two inhabitants of the house, they had some interesting stuff going on in the house. They had more than just a body in their basement. Turns out at one time, there was an S&M club in that corner room where the wine cellar was. Maybe vestiges of Mr. Dr. Bandine's, sadomasochism, the
oh
fact
my
that he loved to torment his patients. Maybe that's what inspired it. But a friend of mine said in the 80s, a friend of his had an S&M club there. Pauline Boren had rented out space to him in the basement. He had a little S&M club going. And by the way, Louisville has a thriving underground S&M club scene, in case you're interested. I found out a lot about S&M and things like that doing research for this book. And supposedly they said Joey and Jeffrey were going to revive the S&M club days. They had some parties, and Jeffrey Mundt, it turns out, was big into rubber and latex. He liked to wear a full body black rubber suit to his sexual escapades. And when they found the picture of Jeffrey Mundt in his rubber suit, people started noticing a lot of similarities between the story of the murder of Jamie Carroll and the house on 4th Street and a show that was in its infancy on TV at the time, American Horror Story. Murder House, the very first episode, the very first season had been showing. And, it's about a old Victorian house that had been a sanatorium at one time.
oh my God.
There's a guy who likes rubber, the rubber man guy, and people started calling the house Kentucky's American Horror Story House. Some have even said it's what inspired the show, but it's not. The show had wrapped up and was showing on TV by the time this murder wasn't covered. So if you hear people say it's inspired American Horror Story, as far as I know, that's not true.
Okay.
But so Jeffrey Mundt liked to wear a full body black rubber suit to these parties. And Jamie Carroll had been one of their guests. So he was their drug dealer primarily, but he was their boyfriend on and off as well. And not only that, Jamie Carroll was a well-known drag queen. When he wasn't Jamie Carroll, he was Ronica Reed, the pageant queen. He had won Miss Gay Pride, West Virginia, just a year before he was murdered. So you just couldn't make this stuff up. So, the more information I found, the more I thought, well, I've got to write a book about this. And so the book is about me sitting in on the trials and trying to figure out what happened, the night of the murder of Jamie Carroll, who really killed him. And it kind of tries to examine, the age-old question, why people do things that they do. Both these accused killers came from good families and had kind of privileged upbringings. But, what happened that, one night something like this occurs, where an innocent person is murdered. And in the process of trying to cover the trials and find out what happened, I talk about the neighborhood and the quirky people I meet along the way, and the city of Louisville itself becomes a character as well. And like I said, I love quirky, I love eccentric. So there's a lot of just trivia and tidbits, worthless information in the book. And that's kind of where the title comes from. Glitterball City. So a dark room in Glitterball City. The dark room is, the wine cellar and S&M room where all the weird things happen. But that's a nickname Louisville enjoys that a lot of people don't know about. Often they call us Derby City. They call us Horse City, Bourbon City, River City, Fall City as well. But Glitterball City. That's a lesser known nickname. They call us Happy Birthday City as well because this is where the Happy Birthday song was written in 1893 by sisters Patty and Mildred Hill, who are music teachers here in Louisville. And but the Glitterball City reference goes to the fact that back in the 70s and 80s, at the height of the world's disco craze, guess where all the disco balls were coming from?
Louisville?
Yeah, and the company is still around today. It's called Omega National Products. And back then, they had a crew of 25 women who produced disco balls by hand. Each of them made like 20 a day. And of those, there's only one left. Her name is Yolanda Baker, and she's getting ready to go into retirement. As far as we know, she's the last hand maker of disco balls left in the world. And but she doesn't make as many as she used to. If she makes 6 a week, she says that's a lot now, because by the 90s, China had come along with mass production, and they outpaced Louisville. So today, Louisville doesn't make the most anymore, but they still make the iconic disco balls, what people consider the best disco balls. And probably all the ones you've ever seen on TV and in movies are Louisville disco balls. That's what John Travolta was dancing under in Saturday Night Fever. It's what they had at Studio 54 in New York City. People are old enough like me to remember Soul Train in the 70s with Don Cornelius, that really huge one. That was Louisville's most famous disco ball at the time. But it's not surprising that a Louisville company would have this tradition with making disco balls, because it was a Kentuckian back in 1917 already who first patented something called the myriad reflector. That was the early disco ball. And throughout the decades, they've called it other things. Omega Products calls theirs a mirror ball. For a time, they called it a glitter ball, and that's what sticks around here. But most people know it as a disco ball. So Glitter Ball City, now you know. And so I try to kind of highlight all these little known claims to fame that we have. Supposedly we have the largest Victorian neighborhood in the country, Old Louisville. Some well-known people come from Louisville. Jennifer Lawrence is from here. She loves to talk about Louisville and her connections. Diane Sawyer, Tom Cruise's family, both sides of his family are old Kentucky families, and the old family mansion is on 3rd Street, just 2 blocks down from where I used to live. And so I try to let people know all the interesting things I think that make Louisville such a wonderful place to live, and especially the old Louisville neighborhood. So that's kind of, yeah, a long answer to a short question, but that's what the book's about. That's how I got into it, and that's a dark room in Glitterball City.
No, that's awesome, because I was gonna ask about the Glitter Ball City, because that was I love the nicknames. I'm down in Nashville,
Uh-huh.
so I know, Music City, and I grew up in Denver, so Mile and I love the little names that you know
Uh,
they have. So I was like, I never heard Glitter Ball City. Tell me
yeah,
more, and
yeah,
you did.
yeah. I was just in Nashville last month for the Southern Book Fest. That
Oh
was that was fun. It was really nice to
yeah,
be
had you
down.
ever been to it
That
before?
was the first time I'd ever been, so it was a great
Oh
experience.
gosh, and is it still as big? I haven't been since before the
Um,
pandemic.
this was the first one they had since the pandemic, as far as I understand, and it was pretty well attended.
Yeah,
A lot of great people were there.
tons of
Made
people.
some interesting
Connect.
friends.
Oh, that's awesome.
Connections, yeah.
And the other thing you had said, well, a couple of things, was when you said, that you were fascinated with Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. One of the reviews on Amazon, well, more than one, was comparing it to like a in the Garden of Good and Evil, but in Louisville, but also with the Leopold and Loeb case, like they kind of merge. I was like, well, that's an interesting. And as you were talking, I'm like, okay, now I can see how people could draw that comparison.
Yeah,
That's
and during the trial, that comparison was made. I even bring it up in the book. Other people, like when I was working with my agent, we were trying to find a publisher. Right off, a lot of people, and I don't shy away from it. I even give John Barrett a shout out in the acknowledgments. Thanks for the inspiration. But people immediately they thought of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, and then a lot of them thought of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which is another book I've always admired, and I love Truman Capote. And yeah, so some said it's kind of a combination of In Cold Blood and Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which I'll take. I mean, if I ever get up to their level, that'll be a very flattering uh, uh, situation if it ever
It
happens. But for the
sounds
time
like
being,
from the reviews, you might already be there. So just
well,
so
let's
you know.
hope. Let's hope. Yeah, the book is still, it's been a year now since it came out, but it went into its second hardcover printing, which is a good sign. The paperback is coming out in the spring, and I can't make any official announcements yet, but my previous writings have garnered some attention from Hollywood, so you might see something on the screen um, about Old Louisville in the future. Might have to do with this book, might have to do with one of my previous books, but keep an ear out, and maybe in a year or two you might see something on the screen.
Oh,
Project.
that's and speaking of the screen, when you brought up the rubber and the S&M and 80s and 90s and all, I mean, I know this murder happened later, but when you were talking about the House of History, another American Horror Story episode, though I don't know if it's still going on. I think all the episodes might be done now, but the most recent um season 11, I guess it must be. I forget what it's. Oh, NYC. How can I forget that? But that's about S&M, and you know how it's just very interesting how far we've come in really
Mhm.
such a short time with the cops. Like when you said the cops, when they went to that house at first, were like, oh, somebody's missing. Well, we don't know, but we'll check on it. But the NYC is covering that too, that the cops, there was violence happening against, you know, the S&M homosexual community, and they were like, that's just doesn't matter. It's very interesting though how far that's.
Yeah, and even in the last 10 years, things have come a long way. So in my book, I have to deal with a lot of dark topics, and some topics that might turn other people off, but I tried to be objective in the way I cover things. And even during the trial, there was a lot of victim shaming. Jamie Carroll, he was their drug dealer. So, like, a lot of people said he brought his murder upon
Oh.
himself. And he had a checkered past. He had problems with the law before, but from what I understand, he was trying to kind of straighten his life out and stuff. And the thing is, no one deserves to get murdered. It doesn't matter what kind of past you have. No one deserves to get murdered. So I really tried my hardest to make Jamie Carroll, appear as a human being, not, the flawed individual he was. But, there were people who were greatly affected by his death. His family was affected. A number of his friends reached out to me as I was writing the book and shared great memories of him. So I tried to portray him as humanely as possible. And then, like I said, I found out a lot about the S&M scene in the city, and people I knew had been involved, and they shared stories with me. So like I said, I did some research and found out some interesting things. So um, there was some kink shaming involved as well. Jeffrey Mundt, the fact that he was into S&M and all these things, um, the 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 defense, when he took the stand against Joey Banis, tried to point out all his fetishes and his sexual proclivities, and they tried to use that as maybe an indicator that would be the reason he murdered Jamie Carroll, because people had said Jeffrey had told them his ultimate sexual fantasy was to kill someone during sex. And so they tried to use a lot of his fetishes and things like that against him. And if you're a consenting adult, there's nothing wrong with S&M. It's all about consenting adults. And he, as far as I know, was always with consenting adults. So you know there's nothing to be ashamed of there. But yeah, we have come a long way. Like I said, even in the 10 years since I started writing the book, I can see people immediately, especially I think maybe the fact that there's so many true crime podcasts and YouTubers and stuff,
Oh.
people are really striving to make sure that the victim is portrayed more humanely. And they're trying to look away from things that, for example, like S&M, that some people might not understand, that might be used against someone. So they're trying to do less kink shaming and things like that. So I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's so much true crime interest today, and there's so many people like you and podcasters who are really, talking about these issues. And you're right. We've come a long way in the last 10, 15, 20 years, I think.
That's really interesting you say that because I've definitely seen that shift to being more victim centric than killer set like people that has really flipped. And when we went to London, it's been a few years now, but we took a Jack the Ripper
Uh-huh.
tour, and our guide right away was like, we will be talking about him, but I need you to know these five names. And he showed pictures of, well, not pictures, but he showed the women, and he was really he showed the women's name. He really wanted us to know them and that this was their story and there wouldn't be a story without them. So it's but I've ever since then now I've really noticed that shift, like you said. And it sounds like you've really done a great job. But I have one other question. I'm cutting myself off midstream, but so the guy who rushed up and bought the house, like that could have, he bought it then, right? After that was
Far as I know, yeah.
oh my gosh. And so were you so happy to, did you know anything about that house other than the wine cellar? Or were you like, phew, dodged a bullet buying that place?
I knew nothing about the house other than they called it the Richard Robinson house, and that the guy who owned it was a like a hardware and a dry goods merchant. That's all I knew about the house because when my partner and I looked at it in the kitchen, we saw a, like an old newspaper article. It was like a lithograph of a stately looking gentleman, and it was about Richard Robinson. And so I suspected he had something to do with the house. So after we looked at the house, I looked him up, and that's when I found out, how many years he had lived there. Not very many, and what his profession was, and he was highly regarded. And other than that, I knew nothing about the house. A lot of people in the neighborhood, when the murder was uncovered, they thought the house was still abandoned. They didn't know people were living there because it was in such bad shape. Some of the two neighbors on either side, they knew people were living there because they would see them come and go. But the front of the house still had kind of a realtor's lockbox on the door. You had to get a code to get in, so they were going in the side door and stuff. But yeah, it was in really, really bad shape, and a lot of people just assumed it was abandoned. They didn't really know it was occupied until the morning of June 18th, 2010.
Wow. So then what's happened to the house now?
Uh, so, and the thing is, I looked at it a second time because after the murder was uncovered and the bank took the house back, I assume, or Jeffrey Mundt sold it. I don't know what happened, but um, it became a stigmatized property. And who wants to live in a house where a terrible murder was uncovered? Well, some people, but a lot of people know. And so, for a couple of years, the value just kept going down. They originally listed it for the price that they sold it to Jeffrey Mundt for, which was $335,000. And in old Louisville, you can get a bargain. I mean, the houses are still pretty affordable. You can get a mansion in decent shape for under $500,000 still today, like with 8 or 10 bedrooms. But the price kept going down and down and down. At one point, it was down to like $119,000. And so a couple bought it. They bought two other properties in the neighborhood at the same time, and they restored one of them and are living in that house. The current house they're renting out to graduate students at the nearby university. So it's been restored, and I've been inside. It's beautiful. It's kind of like a frat house sorority setup. Each student has his or her room upstairs, and they share the downstairs, the kitchen area, the parlor, the den, the study, and it's beautiful on the inside. Beautiful grand staircase, leaded glass windows, and carved mahogany fireplace mantles. Um, so when I was working on the book, you can see pictures of the house if you want. When I was working on the book, I had a Facebook page I set up. It was called The House in Old Louisville, and it became a repository for all things, you know, dealing with the Richard Robinson house and the murder of Jamie Carroll. Anytime something came out on TV, I shared about it, or anything I found, links to chat rooms where they talked about the murder, or pictures of Dr. Bandine or about Pauline Boren, all those things I shared on the page on Facebook called A House in Old Louisville. But when the book came out, we changed it to match the title of my book. So it's called A Dark Room in Glitterball City. So you can go to that page and follow and like, and I still give updates. But if you scroll back through the photos, if you go back to 2013, you can see interior shots of what the house looks like right after it was restored. And I lead walking tours in the neighborhood. During the day, we do history and architecture. And at night, we do haunted history tours. And of course, those are the most popular tours. And so you're not so far away. Next time, come up to Louisville and let me know, and I'll show you around. And of course, the most popular stop for most people is the Richard Robinson House on 4th Street, because a lot of people have heard about it in true crime podcasts, or they've seen it on TV. It's been on 4 or 5 shows already. Snapped Killer Couples has an episode coming out. They've been in town filming. So it's an interesting stop. Yeah, it's restored, and it's occupied and lived in today. And
so far, no more bad things.
yeah, the people I
Knock
talked
on
to
wood.
lived there, they said the house is dead. Like nothing happens.
Good.
But the funny thing is, though, the kids who live there, I don't know if that's the case anymore, but when the house was first rented out, most of the tenants weren't told what happened in the basement. Because in Kentucky, landlords have no obligation to disclose stigmatized property status. A seller would have to tell you about something like that if they knew about it, but a tenant doesn't have to tell. Has no right to find out. A landlord has no obligation to disclose that. So a lot of the people moved in, no idea what happened in their basement, but they found out they usually find out within a couple of weeks, because certain times of the night, if they look out their front window across the street, they see a tall blonde guy with a group of people pointing and laughing at their house. And eventually someone comes outside, because every year a new batch of students comes and goes, but eventually someone will come outside and it's like, why are we on this tour? What's so interesting about our house? And I say, well, you know what happened? Your laundry room downstairs, because that's what it is today. They concreted it over, and it's the laundry area
Whoa.
today. And so they find out what happened in their house. And talking about Jeffrey Mundt, that morning I looked at the house and we encountered each other on the stairway. I always tell people on the tour, it's probably a good thing I didn't buy the house. Like you said, I kind of dodged a bullet, because it could be Jeffrey Mundt telling the story of what I did, David Domine, in the house on 4th Street. The story is, the legend is the house kind of takes over and possesses people. It makes people do terrible things. So who knows what would have happened if I'd bought the house and moved in.
Oh, instead you've done something marvelous.
I hope so.
That's all. And speaking of that, okay, so I was gonna ask you, you're so good. You just like hit all the things I was gonna ask. I'm like, you just take this over. This is marvelous.
Why don't you start me talking? I won't shut up. So you better be.
Love it. But I was gonna ask, like, how do people find? Like, is it we go to your website and can we sign up for tours there? How do we?
If you're interested in tours, the company I run is called Louisville Historic Tours.
That's you.
Right, LouisvilleHistoricTours.com. Yeah, you can go there, and we've generated some copycat tours in the neighborhood. So make sure you do us and not one of our copycat tours. Okay. So it's Louisville Historic Tours, and go to LouisvilleHistoricTours.com. And normally we would close down in the off season when it gets cold around here, but the book has generated a lot of interest. So we've had people come take tours because they want to see the places they read about in the book. So we're going to keep the tours running through the off season. It'll be a little cold out sometimes, so you got to bundle up. But yeah, you can get the tickets at LouisvilleHistoricTours.com, or you can go directly to some place like TripAdvisor or Viator and buy tickets there. But I've been doing the tours in some form or other since 2004. So this is 2023 will be my 19th year of doing tours in some form or other. And yeah, it's a fun thing. I love showing off the neighborhood, even if you don't like ghosts. I tell people you don't need to believe in ghosts to enjoy a good ghost story. It's just a different way to showcase the neighborhood and its history, and then
learn the history. I Yes, I agree.
Yeah, there's so much more to ghost stories than the paranormal, the supernatural. There's folklore, there's architecture, there's history, there's real life
The
character,
culture,
local flavor and culture.
yes,
Yeah.
and food. I mean, there's you can wrap everything. That's
Mhm.
what I love about, like, everybody's like, "Oh, you like spooky?" I'm like, "Well, I do like the spooky story of it, but I love all the other." Exactly.
Yeah. So that's kind of what we strive to do with the tours. Is just we've got different ways to show off the neighborhood. At night we go through the spooky parts and do storytelling. During the day we go through some of the different areas, and it's primarily talking about the different styles of architecture because um, it's a Victorian neighborhood, but we have all these other kinds of architecture, not just, a lot of people, they hear Victorian, they think of like gingerbread houses, like the wooden houses in San Francisco, the painted ladies,
Okay.
that's a style called Queen Anne architecture. And we have Queen Anne houses in Louisville, but in Old Louisville, they have all these other styles. There's Chateauesque, there's Richardsonian Romanesque, Renaissance Revival, Beaux-Arts, Italian. Every house is just different from the one next door. And so if you love old houses, it's definitely a place to come. People are saying it's going to be the new Savannah, the new Charleston. As the word's getting out, more and more people are discovering the interesting architecture, the interesting people who live there. And like I said, with the book, we've generated a bit more interest. So we're seeing more people come and check us out for our great architecture and our spooky stories.
Oh, that's awesome because Louisville is really a cool. I mean, actually, it's funny. It's on my list. We've been up there a lot, but one of the places I've been wanting to get back to lately is up there. There's so much things I want to check out, and now knowing that I'm like, okay, we're doing that. I will
Yeah,
be in touch for
definitely.
a
Yeah.
tour.
Yeah, it's not a huge city, but it's got all the things a city needs, and it's got, Louisville has its own interesting vibe. Um, a lot of people, like when I take them on tours of the neighborhood, they want to know where the money came from to build the mansions, down there. And I always tell them it was basically the three things that Kentucky was and still is known for today that made the neighborhood, that built half of those mansions, bourbon. So there was a lot of bourbon barons. Right down the road is Churchill Downs. So there was a lot of racetrack royalty. Horses were huge and still are today. And then tobacco was the biggest money maker. So there were a lot of titans of tobacco. So I just tell people basically drinking, smoking, gambling, that's what made the city and that neighborhood. So it's really left its mark on the city. It's got a good food scene, um, interesting neighborhoods. Yeah, a lot of things to see and do if you come to
Oh
Louisville.
my gosh, I love how you put that with the bourbon barons and the tobacco titans and the racetrack royalty. Oh my God.
Yeah.
What is that? The alliteration?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know what that's called, but whatever it is, that was
Yep.
brilliant.
Good. I'm glad you picked up on that because yeah, I thought that out for a bit how I could kind of capitalize on those three
I
things.
love it. And it's got
Uh,
all the fancy. I love that. And what about any for you, new books on the horizon? Any?
I've got several in the works, and I'm kind of switching over. All my previous books have been nonfiction. So this one, A Dark Room in Glitterball City, was my first true crime endeavor. And so it's different from my other books. I have like 4 or 5 cookbooks. I've got history and architecture books. My very first book was the collection of ghost stories, from the time when I lived in my house. And that's kind of what started the whole ghost craze in Old Louisville. And people wanted more. So I wrote a follow up book and then another one. There were 3 ghost books and all. But what happened is a couple of years ago, I took those 3 and I edited and updated them and I put them in kind of a best of compilations called True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. And that's what
Ooh.
our tour at night is based on. And so that's like folklore and legends and my story is in there. People wanted to know more about the house where I lived. So the book that you could kind of say is a prequel to Dark Room and Glitterball City is a memoir I wrote. It's called Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. And that's the house I used to live in, the Jacob Whitmer house. And so what I did is I took that one chapter I originally wrote about, I wrote in my first ghost book, and people wanted more. So I expanded that into a whole book, and it became a memoir of that first year I lived in the house. And so I talk more about the would-be paranormal goings on, and some of the really creepy things that happen in the house. Like I said, I was a skeptic, but I had, there were a couple times I left the house in the middle of the night. It was just too creepy. But what I discovered is, yes, I was getting freaked out and having uh, supernatural potentially supernatural things happen in the house. What I discovered was the real life characters in the neighborhood that were really more fascinating than anything else. I met all these interesting people. One of them makes a reappearance in A Dark Room in Glitterball City, and she's everyone's most famous character. But yeah, that's kind of when I found out about all these interesting things about Old Louisville and the city itself. And so a lot of people say that's kind of the prequel to A Dark Room in Glitterball City. It's a memoir about the spooky year I had in this house I lived in on 3rd Street, and kind of sets up A Dark Room in Glitterball City. It's kind of cotton candy compared to A Dark Room in Glitterball City, because there's murder and there's a lot of dark things covered in there. uh, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, it's more kind of fun stuff, but there's some creepy stuff as well. But yeah, that was book number 12. And like I said, book number 13 is A Dark Room in Glitterball City. They're all available on Amazon.com. The 3 books I talked about just now, those are the ones I recommend if you want to find out about Old Louisville.
Okay.
My previous Old Louisville books, the ghost books, they've been edited and updated in that one book. So I tell people to get the newer books, and the last 3, they're all on Audible if you like to listen to books as well.
Oh, and
And
I heard people said the Audible for A Dark Room in Glitterball City was like, it was so good that they read the book, they listened to the Audible, and then they were reading and listening, like they just loved it. Very,
good. Yeah.
you've gotten some really great reviews, so
Yeah. I mean, it's still, it's like 4.5 stars, which is pretty good given the number of reviews I've had. So
really good.
yeah,
Yeah.
it fluctuates a little. Some people don't like the book. You're always going to have your
Oh,
naysayers.
yeah.
But this is the first book I ever did what they always tell authors, which is to not read your reviews on Amazon. Because what happens is, and this happened with my previous books, the good reviews, the 4 or 5 star reviews, they roll in, and then all of a sudden you get that one star, the really bad one, and it kind of hurts your feelings. And then like for the next 2 or 3 days, you kind of mope around. But then, authors are gluttons for punishment. They go back and read them anyway. And so I started reading the reviews on Amazon.com, but then when I got the first really, really bad one, I said, okay, I'm not gonna read anymore
Oh
since then.
no.
So the first week or so, I read the reviews, but then since then, I go back and look at the ratings and stuff. I see kind of the rankings where I am, but yeah, this is the first time I've actually taken people's advice, and I'm not reading the reviews on Amazon.com.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, because wouldn't want anything to get in your head at all
Yeah,
and influence anything coming up, because
yeah.
you've been wonderful, and I did not, I promised you I would not keep, and look what I did.
Oh,
Thank
that's fine.
God I bought the more.
Yeah. Oh, what I was going to say about the books, though, but now I'm switching over to fiction. So my previous books were all nonfiction. The current projects I'm working on are fiction. So I have a novel that I'm revising right now, and my agent's looking for someone that might be interested in it. And then I'm working on a murder mystery series that's going to be set in Old Louisville, and the heroine uh, is a drag queen by the name of Poo Poo Chiffon.
Oh
So
my.
yeah, so I love drag queens, and that culture as well. And I have some friends who are drag queens. So I'm not a drag queen myself. I've never. Well, when I was 12, for like a Halloween party, I did wear a dress once. That's the closest I think I've ever come to drag. There's a lot of drag queens in my future projects, and that kind of ties in with the Glitterball City thing.
Yeah.
Drag shows and things like that. So it's really interesting. The glitter ball phase is kind of really catching on. Louisville is becoming proud of its glitter ball city heritage. Um, Last I heard, the world's biggest disco ball is in the UK someplace. I think Isle of Wight maybe, and it's 33 feet in diameter. So recently, there's a campaign going on in the city. A couple guys started this campaign. It's called world's biggest disco ball, y'all. And they're trying to raise money to be able to have a disco ball twice the size of the one in the UK built and installed someplace here in Louisville. They want it to be 67 feet in diameter. So yeah, hopefully they'll raise the money, and one day soon we'll have the world's largest glitter ball, the world's largest disco ball hanging here in Louisville.
That would be amazing. And what a cool, you could do so much with that.
Oh
You could,
yeah.
that could totally be a city statement.
Mm.
Wow. Oh, I hope that happens.
Yeah, me too.
That's
That'd be more reason to come up and see us.
yes, again and again and again. Oh, Louisville's awesome. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for
Sure, talking to you.
yeah, and spending all this. I did not mean to do that, but you're so fascinating. It's really your fault.
Well, I don't know if I'm that fascinating, but like I said, you can't stop me talking once I start. So thanks for listening to me, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And we'll be keeping an ear out for what's coming next from you, and eyes too, I guess.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks, David.
Take care. Nice talking to you.
You too. Bye-bye.